After our discussion last week on the domestic lifestyles of the 1950s and the consumerism of the Cold War era, and many of your observations that related domestic consumption to the economy, I thought it might be wise and illuminating to look at some of the domestic culture that evolves alongside this Cold War consumerism. To start, we will talk a little bit about music, particularly jazz music, and how it evolved as the setting for which it was consumed evolved, and also some visual art that parallels the development of jazz. When we discussed the 1920s, we talked about the development of jazz as a form of expression during the Harlem Renaissance, a unique African-American form of expression, as well as something that developed at the same time as Prohibition. So we see here Nick's Steakhouse, Greenwich Village, 1920s, and it's a very public, very tightly packed gathering space alongside the evolution of urbanism and the city. Listening to jazz would often occur in a club, maybe a speakeasy, where alcohol was being served, illegal alcohol was being served, and potentially as well as breaking the taboo of prohibition and finding a place to drink. The clientele, which may be predominantly African American or predominantly white, enjoying a band that was African American, or in this case, mostly a white audience and white musicians who have co-opted or appropriated jazz as a style. However, the idea of, again, the taboo of drinking could be coupled with the taboo of a white audience looking for and appreciating black music, which of course still occurs in our suburban settings today, even in Andover. Young, affluent white students may often listen to black music that originates in the context of a very urban situation as a way to explore what might be considered, youthful rebellion or a just integration of culture. So it's not that much different than the 1920s. But the type of music that would be playing in this context would have been early bebop jazz, improvisational jazz, meaning it was unique for the moment, for that evening, and might be slightly different the next evening, even if it was based on the same sort of what we call standard tune. And it was enjoyed with, audience participation, cheering on the musicians when they improvise, when they solo. So if you just pause the presentation at this point and listen to what I've provided as track 1 to give you an idea of what type of jazz we would be talking about in this type of setting. Now, we've already discussed the development of suburbia in the 1940s, 50s, post-war era as the end of World War II brought many people back to the United States. The GI Bill provided at least white working class and white middle class folks with opportunities to buy homes for the first time in mass quantities. We had looked at the Federal Housing Administration in an earlier activity this year and explored, the lending policies and some of the embedded racism in that. But in any event, these large suburban developments, and this is a picture of a planned community, a renowned planned community, Levittown, New York, brought with it a new way to enjoy music and culture domestically whereas the previous urban setting, going out, being with people, seeing music live, is now being replaced with a sort of turn inward into at least the family structure, the family unit, and everybody having their one little piece of turf and home, their own home that they could decorate in their own unique taste, even if that unique taste was almost identical to the neighbors on either side of you. Here are some advertisements that highlight this from the period. The first one shows actually a veteran returning from the war. It's the post-war era, and it's an advertisement for General Electric appliances that could be utilized in the house. But you can see the American dream of homeownership, a couple sketching their plans in the dirt on the park bench is reflecting this new ideal that presumably they will start a family. Keep in mind the time period, the primary sources we looked at last week with regard to the report on the baby boom. So this is a very much culture that is developing and then is being packaged and then sold back to people and perpetuated, where on the right-hand side, this is a little bit later, maybe about 10 years later, we have a 1958 advertisement for Magnavox home furnishings, and there are two, the television set in the bottom left-hand corner and the home stereo system, which is large and bulky and not anything that you're probably acquainted with today. Built-in speakers, most likely a built-in turntable for records, and even a radio, and it can be closed up and has the appearance of a nicely crafted wooden piece of furniture that you might even set a vase of flowers on, or a lamp or something when you're not using it. But the idea is that what you had to usually go out to a club to enjoy, or a music hall, an orchestral music hall or symphonic music hall, which is displayed in the image above. You now can enjoy this at home in the privacy of your own home, in the comfort of your own home. And what's interesting about this image is it does not presuppose the dominance of television today, where the TV is not it only occupies about 15% of the advertisement, right? And there's more focus on the music at this point in time, and the idea of people enjoying recorded music, whereas now I think, most home settings, the television is probably the dominant item in any sort of living room or living space. Now, this might not seem to be what you would expect to see in the next slide, but this is sort of the avant-garde, or the leading innovation in visual art at the time, from about 1945 to 1960, abstract expressionism. And what I'd like you to do is just kind of look at this, minimize the presentation, and play track number 2 that I've listed as you gaze upon this painting and reflect for a few minutes and pause the presentation and then come back to it after you've listened for a little bit and looked at the same time. So again, we have the tail end of bebop, or what was called hard bop, jazz with Thelonious Monk, and a high level of improvisation, the type of music that Jackson Pollock would have been listening to when he actually made this type of painting. And what he was trying to do with visual art is not that much different than what the jazz musicians were doing, which was pushing forward the amount of energy and the amount of action in one space that one can create and make it unique, make it not tied to a historicism the history of music or the history of painting. And Pollock himself said his ideals here were based on democracy, which I'll return to in a minute. But what we want to talk a little bit about here is the technique. He would lay the canvas on the floor of his barn, and he would drip the paint in what we can probably consider to be a rhythmic, ordered chaos. And sort of the first painter to make gestures in space without actually connecting the brush to the surface of the canvas. And what you have as a result is a totally abstract painting, a total enunciation of modernism, a break with tradition. There's no figurative elements, there's no narrative elements, there's no identifiable image or reference to reality or the illusion of reality. And it could be very much dismissed as a mess or something that anybody could be capable of producing. However, in a large-scale painting like this would probably be the size of a wall in the room that you're sitting in. The viewer looking at it is going to be able to see depth, a tremendous amount of depth, without any of the typical historic techniques for creating an illusion of depth, like one-point mathematical perspective or heavy shading and light source to create a three-dimensional image. Instead, when I look at it, I see various white and bluish paint coming forward with a black base in the distant background, and almost as if I'm looking into a starry night sky, a sort of infinite amount of space, and a flatness at the same time, as there is no true three-dimensional illusion created through the typical ways that artists had done it. Now, when I said that Pollock indicated that this was a democratic form of art suitable for the United States, a clean break from European tradition, what he meant was you didn't have to understand anything that came before. You didn't have to be a historian. This isn't a painting with the subject matter being some story of Greek mythology, some story of a great battle with a great general that you would have to be aware of, that you would have to study, or a biblical story. This was something that an alien from outer space could come down and see and appreciate without knowing anything about human history or the history of art. And what this provides at first is bewilderment for most of the population, but it also provides debate and discussion, and also an opportunity. If you had an abstract painting in your home and you were listening to the latest jazz records and you were having a dinner party, this would maybe give you some credibility as being modern yourself or hip, and it would provide an opportunity to discuss and debate. And a lot of historians, art historians in particular, would say that that's where the art really is completed, in the discussion of what it means, in the construction of meaning, not something that was lost on Pollock. And also, again, back to that notion of spontaneity, improvisational qualities. This painting happened, and there can never be another one like it. It's impossible to replicate. And the style of abstract expressionism begins to appear on the covers of the next phase of music development, the next phase of jazz albums that coincide with domesticity. As people are more and more enjoying the music, the recorded music in the home setting, potentially entertaining groups of friends, that means that the style of music needs to change. It can't be as, let's say, loud or jarring at a dinner party as it can in a club where people are dancing and participating in the activity of the music. And so we have what is considered cool jazz, West Coast jazz. Dave Brubeck Quartet Time Out is a great example of California West Coast jazz. And if you just pause the presentation and listen to the next two tracks, one by Dave Brubeck and one by Stan Getz, you'll get a sense for how the music has changed and how it is more digestible in the context of the home, potentially during a dinner party or something like that. Now, after hearing that, I'm sure you detected another distinction between the Brubeck and the Getz. The Getz is appropriating another culture, Brazilian culture, which is something that Stan Getz was known for pioneering into the jazz world. The bossa nova, his work with Gilberto and other Brazilian artists was well renowned for the time. Back to the album art, though, what I would like to point out about Neil Fujita is that he actually was a Japanese American and was interred in a camp during World War II, and started his art career by designing a newspaper for the internment camp and being the illustrator for that paper. Later on, towards the end of the war, in I think about 1944, he actually served in the Pacific campaign and fought in the artillery division of the Army, but it was a segregated division for Japanese Americans, so they weren't allowed to integrate with the other soldiers. So it's an interesting history behind this artist, and you can see he's incorporated the notion of abstract expressionism into the jazz cover. He'd done other ones. He had done covers for Charlie Mingus and other jazz musicians at the time. Olga Albitsu was actually not Brazilian. She was Puerto Rican. And what's interesting about her connection, as she did all of Getz's bossa nova album covers, and she studied under Hans Hofmann, who was a German immigrant who taught in New York. He was a painter who taught many of the abstract expressionist painters, including Jackson Pollock. So there's a connection in terms of their formal education as well. Now, Getz was particularly enjoyable by the population, the domestic population, because what became fashionable in the 50s was not only hosting dinner parties in your home, bringing the entertainment into the home, but also having themed dinner parties where you not just had somebody over for the traditional meatloaf and mashed potatoes, but you went abroad, you went international in the home. So kind of an interesting irony there. And in the first advertisement for wine, Burgundy wine had not been a typical choice drink for Americans. It was associated with Catholicism, obviously Italian immigration, and French. And so for the couple to have the other couple over and choose to have wine for dinner, that's what the advertisement is pushing, makes them seem or appear cosmopolitan and glamorous. And so the themed dinner party might have, French cuisine with wine, and how exciting that would be. Or if you wanted to showcase your new Stan Getz album, you might have some type of South American or Brazilian cuisine to go with that to make it a complete experience. And then on the right side, we see a magazine cover for Homemaker from 1960. And the reason I put that up there is because presumably the husband is hanging an abstract painting, completely abstract painting, and the wife, with a little trepidation, is looking on. And so modernism and being modern starts to make its way into common domestic consumer culture. Also, what we have to remember, we talked about this in some detail in our discussion of Avant and Atomic Cafe. We have this science, this technology that everybody's aware of and in many ways anxious about, in many ways almost psychotic about, but also embracing. Like the future, all of the problems of the future will be solved through science and engineering and development. People are beginning to talk about rockets and the possibility of being in space. Eventually, the Soviet Union launches Sputnik and puts the first man in space, and this ignites a desire for the average American, to be competitively modern. So even if the man and the woman in this advertisement did not particularly enjoy or appreciate or fully understand abstract expressionism, it seemed like the right thing to incorporate in their home furnishings. And here's another advertisement for furniture, and you can see in the left hand an abstract painting. And I put this image in there again, an allusion to the oncoming dominance of television as music becomes, let's say, domesticated. It starts to go into the background of the allure of watching, people might have called it, on television, and then we see what many people might say a degradation of the dinner activity becoming part of the TV experience. The TV tray, you can watch TV while you eat dinner, and then eventually the development of the TV dinner, which is sort of pre-made frozen dinner that you can heat up in the oven and not have to worry about any preparation after a day of work. Home design begins to change dramatically in the 50s, especially for the wealthy, the elite. On the West Coast, we have the Sheets Goldstein House by John Lautner. Lautner was a pioneer in modernizing domestic architecture. We had talked earlier this year about Frank Lloyd Wright and his ideas. And with modern materials, reinforced concrete, as you see, sturdy glass paneling, we see even further developments into breaking away from that traditional home, that colonial style home or classical style home that people associate the house with like the grand entryway and the sidewalk leading up to the door and the shrubs on either side, very symmetrical, to something much more adventurous, something much more reflective of the modern age and the technology age. Were people comfortable looking forward? A good question. A lot of this modern architecture can seem off-putting or repellent to people who were preferring that traditional style of American, what we call American vernacular, the regular everyday type of houses built in suburbs or towns. However, it's most likely something in between. The development of what we call the ranch house, a single story, in some cases prefabricated, meaning it was built before and then put up in pieces, rather than built from the ground up. Like pieces could be prefabricated and then sent to a particular place. A simple sort of design that appeared somewhat modern but also allowed the owners, the family, to kind of arrange it and make it unique to their tastes is probably what was the most popular in the large-scale suburban sprawl in Midwestern and Western cities. Not something as extreme as the Lautner, glass paneled steel houses, but also not something as traditional as the typical colonial house. Another Lautner interior. And finally, the whitening of jazz begins to provoke questions in the hearts of the purists. The 5 musicians have appeared on the cover of Time magazine, and Brubeck was one of them in 1964. And many jazz historians would say that this is sort of like the end of the golden jazz era, because it's become appropriated and domesticated. It doesn't have its innovative flair, its spontaneity, like it had in the 20s, 30s, or even the big band era of the 40s, which we didn't really talk about. And that cool jazz was sort of a whitewashing of jazz. However, there's equal amounts of analysis on the other side of that argument that connects it more with the context. Like, where is the music being listened to? It was forced, it was augmented by the setting, and it had to change. Even when we think about jazz today, it has very little in terms of resemblance to where it was played when it was being developed. I mean, this is a concert at Symphony Hall in Boston with notable jazz musicians, including Charlie Mingus, and several years ago. But now the music itself has been elevated to the level of the great elitist and high art of European symphonic music and orchestral music, which is not what it had been originally intended to be. It was intended to be played in clubs, like Harlem clubs, as an expression of African American art, unique African American art in the early part of the 20th century. So context does change things. And what I have here is my own editorial. The worst way to listen to jazz or any type of music is through earbuds, which many of you would probably disagree with. But it is the way that we probably ingest most of our music today, or appreciate most of our music today. And I chose this particular image to end upon because this could be also detrimental to your auditory organs, especially if you're a regular commuter, a subway commuter who has their music turned up loud enough to overcome the racket and the noise of the typical American subways. It would actually be doing damage to your ears. And it's very insular. It's gone from the club, where people engaged with each other and engaged with the musicians, to the domestic, where it's become inward looking in terms of the family unit, or at least the family unit with a couple of occasional other family units, or couples having other couples over for dinner parties, now to an incredibly individualistic and isolated experience. So again, the context and the development of the way that we live, from an urban setting to a suburban domestic consumerist culture of the 1950s to today's somewhat alienated way of listening to music matters in terms of what music is produced for us to consume.